Sterling guided Clementine through the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, her heels clicking against the wooden boardwalk with a confidence that made every head turn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and he could feel the weight of curious stares following them toward his wagon. This wasn't how he'd imagined walking through town with his new bride. "Nice little place," Clementine observed, her tone suggesting she'd seen much grander cities. "How many people live here?" "About 200, give or take," Sterling replied, helping her up onto the wagon seat. When his hand touched hers, he noticed her skin was soft, but her grip was firm. Nothing like the work-worn hands he'd expected from a farmer's daughter. As they rolled out of town toward his ranch, the silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Sterling kept stealing glances at this mysterious woman who'd taken his intended bride's place. Everything about her seemed wrong for frontier life. Her dress was too fine, her manner too polished, her confidence too urban. "You're wondering about Abigail," Clementine said suddenly, not looking at him. "Among other things," Sterling admitted. "Your letters never mentioned having a sister." Clementine's hands folded tightly in her lap. "Abigail wrote those letters?" Sterling's stomach dropped. "You mean you didn't know about our arrangement?" "I knew," Clementine said carefully, "but I didn't know the details of what she'd promised you." The wagon hit a rut, jostling them together for a moment. Sterling caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and floral that had no business in cattle country. When she steadied herself, her hand briefly touched his arm, and he felt an unexpected jolt of awareness shoot through him. "So you don't know anything about ranching," he said, more statement than question. "I know plenty about surviving," Clementine replied, her voice carrying an edge that made him look at her sharply. "Sometimes that's more useful than knowing how to milk cows." Sterling was about to ask what she meant when they crested the hill overlooking his property. The ranch spread out below them, corrals, barn, and the main house he'd built with his own hands, hoping to fill it with a family. It looked smaller somehow with this sophisticated stranger beside him. "It's beautiful," Clementine said, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train, her voice sounded genuine. "Abigail would have loved it." "Would have?" Sterling caught the past tense immediately. "What happened to my sister, Miss Shaw?" Clementine's face went pale, and she looked away toward the horizon where storm clouds were gathering. "That's what we need to discuss, Mr. Maddox. But first, I need you to understand that nothing about this situation is what it appears to be." Sterling felt the first cold drops of rain on his face, but the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the weather. The rain started in earnest as Sterling unhitched the horses, fat drops drumming against the barn roof like an impatient heartbeat. Clementine stood in the doorway, watching him work with those calculating eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Her traveling dress was already spotted with moisture, the fine fabric clinging to her curves in ways that made Sterling's concentration slip. "Your sister," he said without looking up from the harness. "Is she dead?" "No." Clementine's voice was quiet but firm. "She's alive, but she's not coming, Sterling. Not ever." Something in her tone made him stop what he was doing and face her fully. "What do you mean?" "Not ever." Clementine stepped deeper into the barn, her heels silent now on the hay-covered floor. "Abigail is married. Has been for 2 months. She married the preacher's son back home the day after she sent you her last letter." Sterling felt like he'd been kicked by a horse. "Married? But she agreed to—" "She was 16 and scared," Clementine said, moving closer. "When the preacher's boy started paying attention to her, she panicked. She'd never been further than 20 miles from home, and the idea of traveling to some unknown territory terrified her. So she just forgot to mention she'd changed her mind?" Sterling's voice rose with anger and humiliation. "She let me wait at that station like a fool?" "She wrote you a letter explaining everything," Clementine said, "but our father tore it up before it could be sent. He said a deal was a deal, and the Shaw family honor demanded someone fulfill the obligation." Sterling stared at her, understanding beginning to dawn like a sickening sunrise. "So he sent you instead." "He didn't send me." Clementine's chin lifted defiantly. "I volunteered." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Sterling studied her face, looking for deception, but all he saw was a determination that bordered on desperation. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you volunteer to marry a stranger?" Clementine's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment, he glimpsed something vulnerable underneath her polished exterior. "Because I had to get away from home, and this seemed like the only way to do it without bringing shame on my family." Thunder rolled overhead, and lightning flashed through the barn doors, illuminating her face in stark relief. Sterling realized that whatever had driven this woman to take her sister's place, it was something serious enough to make her risk everything on a stranger's mercy. "What were you running from?" he asked softly. Clementine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller despite her confident posture. "There's a man back home. Someone my father wants me to marry. Someone I'd rather die than spend my life with. Is he cruel?" "Worse," she whispered. "He's boring. And rich. And he sees me as property to be acquired." Sterling felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward this complicated woman who'd turned his simple plans upside down. But before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats outside made them both freeze. "You expecting someone?" Clementine asked, her face going pale. Sterling shook his head, moving toward his rifle. "Nobody travels in weather like this unless it's urgent." The hoofbeats stopped just outside the barn, and a man's voice called out through the rain, "Sterling Maddox, we need to talk about the woman you picked up at the station today." Sterling grabbed his rifle and stepped into the rain, leaving Clementine in the barn doorway. The man on horseback was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that dripped water onto the muddy ground. Despite the storm, he sat straight in his saddle with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Deputy Marshal William Hayes," the man called out, raising his hands to show he meant no immediate threat. "I need to speak with you about the woman who arrived on today's train." Sterling's grip tightened on his weapon. "What business is that of yours, Marshal?" "She's wanted for questioning back in Missouri," Hayes replied, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Been tracking her for 3 weeks now. Name's Clementine Shaw, and she's suspected of theft." Behind him, Sterling heard Clementine's sharp intake of breath. He didn't turn around, but every muscle in his body tensed. "What kind of theft?" $500 from her employer. "Prominent businessman named Cornelius Whitmore. Says she was his personal secretary before she disappeared with his money." Sterling's mind raced. Clementine had mentioned running from a man her father wanted her to marry. Someone boring, rich, and who saw her as property. Cornelius Whitmore fit that description perfectly. "Even if that's true," Sterling said carefully, "seems like a civil matter between employer and employee. Why is a U.S. Marshal involved?" Hayes shifted in his saddle, rain pouring off his coat. "Because Mr. Whitmore has connections in Washington, and because theft of that amount constitutes a federal crime when it crosses state lines. I didn't steal anything." Clementine's voice cut through the rain as she stepped out of the barn, her dress already soaking through. "That money was payment for services Whitmore refused to acknowledge." Hayes studied her with the cold calculation of a lawman. "That's not how Mr. Whitmore tells it. Says you took the money from his safe the night before you disappeared." "What he's not telling you," Clementine said, moving closer to Sterling, "is that he's been forcing his female employees into situations no decent woman should have to endure. That money was compensation for months of his unwanted advances." Sterling felt rage building in his chest. The pieces were falling into place now. A powerful man using his position to exploit women, and when one of them finally stood up to him, he used the law to hunt her down. "You have any proof of these allegations, Miss Shaw?" Hayes asked. "Would it matter if I did?" Clementine's voice was bitter. "Whose word carries more weight? A rich businessman with political connections, or a woman with no family wealth to back her up?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Sterling could see the conflict in the marshal's eyes. He'd probably seen enough corruption to know Clementine was likely telling the truth. "I still have to bring you back," Hayes said finally, "but I can promise you'll get a fair hearing." "No." Sterling stepped between them, his rifle still ready. "She's under my protection now." Hayes' eyes narrowed. "You planning to interfere with a federal investigation, Maddox?" "I'm planning to protect my wife," Sterling said, the lie coming easier than he'd expected. "We were married this afternoon by Justice Morrison in town." The marshal's expression showed he didn't believe the claim, but proving it would be difficult in this weather. "Can you produce a marriage certificate?" Sterling's heart pounded as he realized he'd just backed himself into a corner that could get them both arrested. The silence stretched between the three of them like a taut wire ready to snap. Rain drummed against the barn roof, and Sterling could feel Clementine's eyes boring into the back of his neck. He'd just claimed her as his wife to protect her from the law, but now he had to make that lie believable. "The certificate is in the house," Sterling said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "along with the witness signatures." Marshal Hayes studied them both through the downpour. "Mighty convenient timing, this marriage. Miss Shaw steps off the train this afternoon and you're wed by evening." Love doesn't wait for convenience, Clementine said, stepping closer to Sterling until her arm brushed his. The contact sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the cold rain. Sometimes you know immediately when you've found the right person. Sterling glanced at her, surprised by how convincingly she was playing along. Her face showed just the right mix of defiance and devotion that a new bride might display when protecting her husband's honor. Besides, she continued, Sterling and I have been corresponding for months. We knew each other's hearts long before we met in person. Hayes wasn't buying it entirely, but Sterling could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression. I'll need to see that certificate before I leave. Of course, Sterling nodded. But first, let's get out of this storm. You're welcome to dry off by the fire while we fetch the paperwork. As they moved toward the house, Clementine stumbled slightly on the muddy ground. Sterling instinctively reached out to steady her, his hand finding the small of her back. Even through her wet dress, he could feel the warmth of her skin, and when she looked up at him with grateful eyes, something shifted between them that had nothing to do with their charade. Inside the house, Sterling lit the oil lamps while Hayes dripped water on the wooden floor. The marshal's sharp eyes took in every detail of the sparsely furnished main room, the single place setting on the table, the obvious lack of feminine touches that would suggest a woman lived there. Cozy place, Hayes observed, though it doesn't look like a woman's been living here. I only arrived today, Clementine said quickly. Haven't had time to unpack my things yet. Sterling disappeared into his bedroom, heart pounding as he tried to figure out how to produce a marriage certificate that didn't exist. Through the thin walls, he could hear Clementine and Hayes talking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. When he returned to the main room, Clementine was sitting by the fire, her damp hair falling loose around her shoulders. She'd removed her outer dress and sat in just her chemise and petticoat, the thin fabric clinging to her curves in ways that made Sterling's mouth go dry. Hayes was pointedly looking anywhere else. I'm afraid there's a problem, Sterling announced, hating himself for what he was about to say. The certificate isn't where I thought I left it. Must have misplaced it during the excitement of the day. Hayes's expression hardened. How convenient. But Justice Morrison will confirm the marriage in the morning, Clementine added. He lives just outside town. Morning's a long way off, Hayes said, standing up, and I've got orders to bring Miss Shaw back to Missouri immediately. Sterling watched as the marshal's hand moved toward his gun, and he realized their time was up. In a few seconds, Hayes would attempt to arrest Clementine, and Sterling would have to choose between letting her go or resisting a federal officer. But before anyone could move, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching through the storm, and Hayes's face went pale. Whitmore, he whispered. He said he might follow my trail if I was taking too long. Sterling felt Clementine's hand slip into his, her fingers ice cold with fear. If Cornelius Whitmore is here, she said quietly, then we're all in more danger than you know. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button. Share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 10 a.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter, because out here in the West, no one waits around. The hoofbeats grew louder, and through the rain-streaked window, Sterling could see the flickering glow of torches approaching. Marshal Hayes moved to the window, his face grim as he counted the riders. 4 men, he said quietly. Whitmore brought hired guns. What kind of businessman travels with armed men? Sterling asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The kind who doesn't limit his business to legal ventures, Clementine said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cornelius Whitmore owns half the politicians in Missouri and most of the judges. What he can't buy, he takes by force. Sterling felt his blood run cold as understanding dawned. You're telling me a federal marshal is working for a criminal? Hayes turned from the window, his face flushed with shame. Whitmore has documentation that makes his claims look legitimate, and he pays well for cooperation. But I'm starting to think I've been played for a fool. The riders stopped outside, and a commanding voice cut through the storm. Hayes, I know you're in there. Bring the woman out now and there won't be any trouble. Clementine stood up abruptly, her hand shaking as she reached for her dress. I won't let innocent people die because of me. I'll go with him. Like hell you will, Sterling said, grabbing her wrist. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and when she looked at him, he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Whitmore doesn't just want his money back. He wants to make an example of me, to show other women what happens when they resist him. Then we don't let him have you," Sterling said firmly. He turned to Hayes. "How much influence does this man really have?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his conscience. "Enough to make people disappear when they become inconvenient. I've heard stories, but I never wanted to believe them." Outside, Whitmore's voice grew more impatient. "You have 1 minute to produce the Shaw woman, or we're coming in." Sterling moved quickly to his gun cabinet, pulling out ammunition and a second rifle. "Hayes, you can ride away right now and pretend you never found us. Or you can help us fight a man who's been using federal authority to cover his crimes. If I help you, my career is over," Hayes said. "If you don't," Clementine said softly, "you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you helped a monster destroy innocent people." Sterling handed the spare rifle to Hayes, then turned to Clementine. Without thinking, he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. The gesture was intimate, protective, and completely natural. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her. "You're under my protection now. That's not just words." For a moment, the danger outside faded away as they stared at each other. Clementine's lips parted slightly, and Sterling felt himself leaning closer, drawn by an attraction that had been building since she'd stepped off that train. But before their lips could meet, the front door exploded inward, and armed men poured into the house. "Well, well," said a cultured voice from behind them. "Looks like we interrupted something important." Cornelius Whitmore stepped through the broken doorway like a man entering his own parlor. He was older than Sterling had expected, perhaps 50, with silver hair and expensive clothes that somehow remained immaculate despite the storm. His cold blue eyes swept the room, taking in every detail before settling on Clementine with the possessive stare of a man who considered her his property. "My dear Clementine," Whitmore said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "You've led me on quite a chase. I do hope you've enjoyed this little adventure because it's time to come home." "This is my home now," Clementine said, moving closer to Sterling. "I'm married." Whitmore's laugh was like ice cracking. "Married? To this frontier nobody. My dear girl, you can't possibly believe that charade will protect you." Sterling stepped forward, his rifle trained on Whitmore's chest. "She's my wife, and she's staying here." "Your wife?" Whitmore pulled a folded paper from his coat. "According to the marriage records I've examined, no such ceremony took place. Justice Morrison confirms he performed no weddings today." Sterling's heart sank as he realized Whitmore had already been to town, already checked their story. The man was thorough, methodical, and apparently had resources Sterling couldn't match. "But let's discuss the real issue," Whitmore continued, signaling his men to spread out around the room. "Clementine stole $500 from me, and theft is a crime regardless of her marital status." "I didn't steal anything," Clementine said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I took payment for services you refused to compensate me for." "Services?" Whitmore's eyes glittered with malice. "Is that what you're calling it now? I remember you being much more cooperative when you thought you could advance your position through my favor." Sterling saw red, the implication in Whitmore's words. The way he looked at Clementine like she was something he owned made every protective instinct Sterling possessed roar to life. "You son of a—" Sterling started forward, but Hayes grabbed his arm. "Easy," the marshal whispered. "He's trying to provoke you into doing something stupid." Whitmore smiled, clearly enjoying the effect his words had on Sterling. "Oh, but I haven't told you the best part yet. You see, Mr. Maddox, your wife isn't just a thief. She's also a murderer." The word fell into the room like a thunderclap. Clementine went white as a sheet, and Sterling felt the bottom drop out of his world. "That's a lie," Clementine whispered. "Is it?" Whitmore pulled out another document. "The night you disappeared, my business partner Marcus Jennings was found dead in his office, beaten to death with a fireplace poker. Several witnesses saw you arguing with him earlier that evening." Sterling looked at Clementine, searching her face for some sign that this was all an elaborate lie. But what he saw there made his blood freeze. She wasn't denying it. "Tell him, my dear," Whitmore said softly. "Tell your husband what really happened that night." Clementine straightened her shoulders, meeting Whitmore's cold stare with steady eyes. "Marcus Jennings attacked me that night. He cornered me in his office after everyone else had gone home." "Self-defense?" Whitmore's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "How convenient. He'd been drinking. Clementine continued, her voice gaining strength. He said Whitmore had promised him time with me as payment for a business deal. Said I belonged to both of them now. Sterling felt rage building in his chest as the picture became clear. These men had treated Clementine like property to be traded between them. When I refused, he grabbed me, Clementine said, tore my dress, said he'd take what he wanted whether I agreed or not. So I picked up the fireplace poker and hit him. Once? Whitmore asked. Until he stopped moving. Clementine's voice was steady, but Sterling could see the pain in her eyes. I took the money from the safe because I knew I could never go to the authorities. Who would believe a secretary over two prominent businessmen? Hayes stepped forward, his face grim. Sounds like justifiable homicide to me. Does it? Whitmore smiled coldly. Unfortunately, Mr. Hayes, you won't be around to testify to that opinion. Sterling saw the trap too late. Two of Whitmore's men had positioned themselves behind Hayes while everyone was focused on Clementine's story. Before anyone could react, one of them struck the marshal across the head with his gun butt. Hayes crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Now then, Whitmore said pleasantly, let's discuss terms. Clementine will return with me to face justice for her crimes, and Mr. Maddox will unfortunately suffer a tragic accident while resisting a federal arrest. You can't kill a federal marshal and expect to get away with it, Sterling said, though he was calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. Can't I? Hayes came here alone against orders to pursue a dangerous fugitive. When backup arrives tomorrow, they'll find him and you both dead, killed by the desperate woman who's now fled deeper into the territory. Sterling realized with growing horror that Whitmore had planned this perfectly. The man would eliminate all the witnesses and emerge as the victim of a violent criminal. There's just one problem with your plan, Clementine said quietly. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Oh? Justice Morrison didn't marry us this afternoon, she said, reaching into her bodice and pulling out a folded document. He married us 3 hours ago when we stopped in town on our way here. Sterling stared at her in shock as she handed him the paper. It was a genuine marriage certificate, signed and witnessed. You see, Clementine said to Whitmore, I knew you'd check the afternoon records, so we made sure to get married in the morning before anyone would think to look. Whitmore's face darkened with fury. It doesn't matter. You're still a murderer. Actually, came a voice from the doorway. She's a hero. Everyone turned to see Justice Morrison himself standing in the broken doorway, flanked by Sheriff Blake and 3 armed deputies. Morrison held up a telegram. Just received word from the authorities in Missouri, Morrison announced. Marcus Jennings was wanted for the rape and murder of 2 women. Seems Miss Shaw here saved them the trouble of a trial. Whitmore's confident expression crumbled as he realized his carefully laid plans were falling apart around him. Whitmore's men looked between their boss and the armed deputies, clearly calculating whether their pay was worth dying for. The answer came quickly as they dropped their weapons and raised their hands. This is impossible, Whitmore snarled. I have documentation, witnesses. You have lies, Sheriff Blake interrupted, stepping into the room. Turns out, when we started digging into your business dealings, we found a lot of interesting connections. Murdered women, missing persons, bribed officials. The federal government is very interested in talking to you, Mr. Whitmore. Whitmore's face went pale as the reality of his situation sank in. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can, Morrison said, holding up another telegram. Your own business partner, Thomas Crawford, decided to cooperate with authorities when he learned about Jennings's death. Seems he's been keeping detailed records of your illegal activities as insurance against this very situation. Sterling watched as Whitmore's empire crumbled around him. The man who'd seemed so powerful just minutes ago now looked like nothing more than a cornered animal. Marshal Hayes will live, one of the deputies reported, kneeling beside the unconscious lawman. Nasty bump, but he'll be fine. As the deputies led Whitmore and his men away in shackles, Sterling found himself alone with Clementine for the first time since this nightmare began. She stood by the fireplace, still holding the marriage certificate, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. So we're really married, Sterling said softly, approaching her slowly. We are, Clementine replied, looking up at him with those dark eyes that had captivated him from the moment she stepped off the train. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of making it official. When did you do it? While you were hitching the wagon. I slipped away and found Justice Morrison, told him the truth about everything and asked for his help. She smiled slightly. Turns out he's been suspicious of Whitmore's activities for months. Sterling reached out and gently took the certificate from her hands, setting it on the mantelpiece. "So what happens now, Mrs. Maddox?" "Well," Clementine said, stepping closer until they were nearly touching, "I suppose that depends on whether you want to be married to a woman who's nothing like the sweet, modest bride you were expecting." Sterling cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, as he'd wanted to do since that moment in the barn. "I think I like the woman I got much better than the one I was expecting." When their lips finally met, it was with the desperate intensity of two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. The kiss deepened as months of loneliness and fear gave way to passion and hope. When they broke apart, breathless, Clementine smiled up at him with genuine happiness for the first time since he'd known her. "I love you, Sterling Maddox," she whispered. "I love you too, Clementine Maddox," he replied, and kissed her again. Outside, the storm had passed, and morning sunlight streamed through the broken door of what was now truly their home. Together, they would rebuild what had been damaged and create something stronger than either had dared to dream possible. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.